بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. We begin in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the compassionate, the merciful. We ask that He send peace and blessings upon our noble and our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wasallam. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He purifies our intentions and our hearts through His gentleness, generosity, mercy, and ease, and that He meld our intentions with the intentions of our pious predecessors, among them the compiler of this work and the compiler of the hadiths that he took from, and those who narrated the hadiths and the Sahaba, the companions. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be well pleased with them all, and meld our intentions with the intentions of our noble and our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Thank you for joining us for another lesson of this course that's focusing on 40 hadith that have to do with fasting the month of Ramadan. This is lesson 2. In lesson 1, for those of you who haven't been able to listen to it yet, we talked just about the introductory items. We talked about the compiler, if you want to call the author, Imam al-Nabahani, his life a little bit. We talked about the text itself and the genre itself of 40 hadiths. We talked about what are the table of contents, because it's 40 hadith collections. So what are those other collections about? We just dealt with kind of some introductory items. Today we're going to jump right into the text, inshallah, and try to keep, as we said before, ourselves to keep the lessons short. So the compiler begins this compilation by saying the following: I begin this in the name of Allah, the bestower of great and subtle mercies, and we ask Allah to send mercy and peace upon our Master Muhammad, the leader of all messengers, and upon his folk and companions in their entirety. To proceed, this is a compilation of 40 hadiths concerning the virtue of Ramadan and fasting, both obligatory and voluntary fasts. And that's where we took the name of the course from, or a slight variation of it. We called it Prophetic Guidance on the Holy Month of Ramadan, 40 hadith on the merits of Ramadan, its fast, and voluntary fast throughout the year. So the compiler then, Imam al-Nabahani, Allah yarhamu, he continues right away into the first hadith, which we'll spend the rest of today talking about. He says, Abu Hurairah, Allah be well pleased with him, said that the Messenger of Allah, Allah bless him and give him peace, said, when Ramadan enters, the gates of the heavens are opened. Okay, and now what he's going to do, this is important, we have to pause for a second. He's going to meld different variations of the hadith together, but he's going to cite that they're not the exact same source, right? So he began with one sentence, right? That Abu Hurairah, Allah be well pleased with him, said that the Messenger of Allah said, when Ramadan enters, the gates of the heavens are opened. Now you could put dot. One version of the hadith says, the gates of paradise are opened. And I'm going to keep going for a second. Let me pause. Notice, in English, it's a little bit tricky, because the word heaven we sometimes use for paradise. Okay? But that's a translation of literally like the skies. So in the first variant, he says, when Ramadan enters the gates of the skies. But that doesn't sound exactly very, very eloquent in English. The gates of the heavens are opened, right? Then one version of the hadith says the gates of paradise, which we also call heaven. So it's a little bit confusing in English, right? So when Ramadan enters, the gates of the heavens are opened. When Ramadan enters, the gates of paradise are opened. And then the continuation of that narration, and the gates of hellfire are closed, and the devils are chained. So 3 things. The gates of paradise are open, the gates of hellfire are closed, and the devils are chained. And then he's going to end with one variant. And in another narration, the gates of mercy are opened, instead of the gates of heaven, or the heavens, or paradise. And he says, the compiler, that this is narrated by Bukhari and Muslim. So the first thing we want to do, and this is always kind of the first step when you study hadith, is you want to say, where is this hadith found? Who narrated it? This is an important question. So first we want to think that a hadith, what is it? It's something that the Prophet ﷺ said, he did, something that occurred in front of him and he allowed to occur, a description about him. And then that was witnessed or heard by one of his companions and then passed down 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 generations. 8 people really is better to say than generations. 8 people later, until you get to a place where there is a point in Islamic history that compilations of the hadith of Prophet ﷺ are kind of are put together and are considered stable. They stabilize. There were always books being written. There were always texts and manuscripts of the Prophet ﷺ sayings being written. But by the time you get to, the late 4th century, 5th century, most of what the Prophet ﷺ had said and did had been written in codexes that we had access to, that had been studied, okay? So our question is, where can we find these 40 hadith? Where can we find them in those works, those central works from the first, 3-4 centuries of Islam? So he says it's found in Bukhari and Muslim. That means that the text of what the Prophet ﷺ said or did is found in this collection of Bukhari or collection of Muslim, meaning the Sahih of Bukhari and the Sahih of Muslim, as well as the chain from Bukhari or Muslim all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wassalam. So in regards to Bukhari, yes, it's found in Bukhari if you go back to it. And he mentions the text in the hadith in more than one area. And one of the areas that he mentions it in, it's important to note, is on the description of Iblis, Satan, and his soldiers. And this is going to come up later in a moment. With regard to Imam Muslim's Sahih, it's also found there's a number of variants. And it's in the section on the virtues of Ramadan. The same hadith, or a variant of it, is found in the Muwatta of Imam Malik, in the Sunan of Al-Nasa'i, in the Sahih of Ibn Khuzaymah, in the Sunan of Al-Darimi, in the Sunan Al-Kubra of Al-Nasa'i, different than the Sunan, first one, and the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. And as far as I was able to tell, all of them go back to Sayyidina Abu Hurairah. However, there might be some difference. One would need to make sure that they have them all together. But they all go back to the Sahabi Abu Hurairah radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. But there is variance in the wording, and that is going to be important. Whenever there's a variation in a hadith, one of the ways that can vary is the exact word structure, sentence here, a sentence there. Sometimes there's big differences. Sometimes those differences they don't have any impact on the meaning of the hadith. Sometimes they have serious impact. And sometimes they just impact how we can understand the hadith. One of the things I hope that we can together get from this course is not just the content, but also an idea of how to engage with hadith. As people who are not specialists, we need some kind of certain axioms so that we're not tripped up when we engage the hadith literature. So one of the things is, yes, there are these different chains, people saying these texts of the Prophet ﷺ, and there are going to be variations, not just in who said to who, the chain, but what the Prophet ﷺ said, right? There's going to be variation in the wording. And here we're going to see that the variations are important. It's going to impact how we understand this hadith. Okay, so let's move on kind of to the main question that we're going to spend most of today talking about. I'm just going to go back and kind of view a general gist of the hadith. The general gist of the hadith is the Prophet ﷺ said about Ramadan, that when Ramadan begins, when it enters, the gates of heaven, the gates of paradise are open, the gates of hellfire are closed, and devils are chained. Okay, so you got three things. Two of them are closely related. Heaven and hell's doors are opened and closed, and the devils are chained. So one of the main questions that come to mind is, wait, is what the Prophet ﷺ saying, is that supposed to be real or metaphorical? Meaning, are actually the gates of heaven open during Ramadan? Are the gates of hell actually closed? Are there actually devils who are physically chained? This is kind of the main question that the ulama wanted to kind of think about, and what the Prophet ﷺ intended, right? Because the Prophet ﷺ said these words, and we have a very high level of probability, if not certainty, that he said them. This hadith is, as we noted, widely reported and narrated in many of the main central works of hadith literature. And the fact that it's in Bukhari and Muslim itself serves to really show kind of the level of probability, if not certitude, of the statement of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ having said this, or some version of it. What are we supposed to understand from it, right? That's kind of what we want to spend the rest of the day talking about. So the first question is, are the devils really chained? And are the gates of heaven and hell really open or closed, meaning heaven open and gates closed? Or is it some type of metaphorical statement to mean something else? what we find is that the ulama are, have varying opinions. Both kind of positions, it's real, it's a metaphor, are both held and are both valid. For example, I'm just going to give you some examples. Al-Qadi Iyad says, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy upon him, famous hadith scholar. He says it is real, meaning that the devil's being chained, and it's a sign of the entrance of the month and its sanctity, and they are tied so they can't harm the believers. This is no reason to think it's a metaphor. The Prophet ﷺ told us this is what happens, and we believe that it happens. There's no intellectual problem with that occurring. Just like Allah, the one who created them, He can chain them up. Another alim about this, the chaining of the devil, says it could be a certain subsection, right? So not all of them, and they are tied the nighttime. He said during the evenings of Ramadan, just like they were banned, as is told in the Quran, when revelation was revealed, right? So the Quran alludes to the fact that a certain category of devils that used to go and listen and spy on what the angels were doing near the heavens, that they were banned, right? They were no longer allowed to pierce into that part of the heavens. So he said the Quran says that, right? So this is just furthering in that. Now that this group is further being harmed, or a specific subgroup of them is being not just banned from spying, but they're physically being chained. So these are both with the meaning that it's real. A third opinion that held that it was real is they held the position that only a specific subsection of the demons were being tied up, just like the second position. But they held that subsection is known as the marada. And this is a word that finds its way, or we find it, in certain narrations of the hadith. So remember how we talked about there's different variants of it. Some of the variants actually have the word, that the type of demons that were being locked up were known as the marada. And we'll actually see a version that mentions the word marada in a few hadith to come in the collection. But you find this in Tirmidhi, you find it importantly in Ibn Khuzaymah's Sahih. And interestingly, Ibn Khuzaymah actually titles the section of the hadith that those who are locked up are the marada, right? In other words, clearly this conversation was important to him, and it was something that he had thought about or engaged with, and he wanted to clarify that it's not all of them. It's a subsection known as the marada, and look, there's a narration I have going back to the Prophet ﷺ where he uses that word, a certain subclass of the shayateen that are locked up. And we'll talk more about this when we get to it, but that's one of the positions. Similarly, if we look at the gates, are they really opened? Some of the ulama mention the same thing. Yes, they are open and closed. There's no reason to believe otherwise. One of the ulama mentions that it is real and it encourages us to do good. Knowing that it's open is a type of encouragement for us. Then we find the other half. So if we talk about that's the first half that considered it real, another group considered it to be a metaphor, that it's not necessarily meant to be literal. For example, they said that this is just indicative of a lot of reward and pardon during the month, meaning that the gates of heaven are open, the gates of hell are closed. This is saying that there's reward and there's pardon. Another one of the ulama message, what Allah opens for His servants in good deeds, in other words, He makes it easy for us to do good deeds, and it's that those good deeds are a means to heaven. And the closing of the gates of fire, what is meant by it is kind of pushing away our drive from sin, which itself leads to the fire. So it's a metaphor, right? We're encouraged, it's made easy for us to do good, we're driven away or pushed away from doing bad. Therefore, the metaphor is the gates of heaven are open and the gates of the hellfire are closed. Another one of the ulama says, again, that, it makes people's souls become, disliking of sin, and they like good deeds. A very similar kind of opinion to the one that was just mentioned. With regard to the demons, interestingly, the ulama that believed that it was a metaphor, they also had a number of different positions. But in order to kind of keep to the time to be short, Generally, the point that they try to put forward is that it was through our good deeds and our striving that they would no longer have an impact on us. Meaning that it's not that they're locked up, but it's through kind of, for example, that encouragement, through good deeds being made easy, evil being displeasing to us, that they no longer have an impact on us. Through that kind of that effort that we put in, that they usually have an impact through our desires and our food, etc. And through us not turning to that, they lose any type of dominion over us. And it's as though they're locked up, right? So that's generally how the ulama dealt with that. One last point that we can kind of mention before we move on to the second section that I want to talk about, and we can end there, is that the ulama also mentioned that some of them said, well, this is kind of almost like telling us, look, in Ramadan, things are made, everything's brought to you like on a silver platter. Things are made easier for you. So now you have no excuse. Don't blame the shayateen. Good deeds have become easy. The reward for them is multiplied. Bad deeds become harder to do, right? And it's easier to be forgiven. Everything's being made easy. There's no excuses left. That's one of the things that also the ulama mentioned. So just again to re-summarize before we go on to the next point, the hadith basically says that heaven and hell's gates are either opened or shut. Heaven's gates are open, hell's gates are shut, and that the demons or the devils are locked up. How the ulama dealt with that, it's either real or it's metaphorical or some type of combination of the two. The ones that held it to be real, they said there's no problem, there's no intellectual problem with it. There's no rational problem with it. Some of them said it was a specific subsection, the marada being one of the key ways that they dealt with it, this kind of subsection. The other group said it's a metaphor, right? It's a metaphor for our being pushed to do good, things being made easy for us, pardon and reward, and that's how they dealt with it. Or some type of combination of the two, which one can kind of consider. The next thing that we want to talk about with regards to this is, based upon that, what are some takeaway points that we can have from this hadith? The main kind of takeaway is, regardless if it is a real or it's a metaphorical locking of doors and opening of doors, is that within the month of Ramadan, we are striving physically and spiritually such that our focus on things that are lowly is no longer there, or at least it's diminished. And we are no longer distracted by food and drink and intimacy, and rather we're focused on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we're going to see in a hadith that's coming soon that this is one of the main points of the fast, the main point of Ramadan. And that the kind of the path to the hellfire is it's laid down with bricks that have to do with our desires, right? And so when we don't focus on our desires, we don't take that path. And the demonic forces only really impact us through those desires. And so when we, tighten the noose right around them, and we tighten it, we cut off, we sever the impact that they have on us, then our only path is towards kind of the heavenly world, right? Inshallah. So that's kind of the main spiritual takeaway from this, regardless if it's a metaphor or regardless if it's real. Some of kind of the intricacy takeaways for those who are interested in hadith is that sometimes details like this, like wording between narrations, is very important. That's why one of the first things that you have to do when you talk about an issue in regard to hadith, any topic, is that you gather all of the hadith in the subject. Because you might find something that says here, something that's said there, this difference might have an impact. The Prophet ﷺ might have said one thing and then said after that, this no longer applies, right? So it's very important that a person who's looking at a hadith not jump to a conclusion just because of one hadith, right? For example, this wording of marada, if a person were to take this position, as some of them did, it changes the meaning a little bit. It does, right? No longer do you perceive that all demons are locked up, well, it's a certain subsection of them, right? So how you kind of deal with these meanings is important. So gathering reports is really important. One last thing is that the ulama mentioned an axiom, even though here you're going to see them disagree, is they said we don't usually go from the literal meaning to a metaphorical meaning unless there's a reason to, unless there's evidence from the text or rational evidence for why that's the case. And here you have textual evidence that pushes it in a different direction. It specifies it to a specific type. But this is important because as kind of non-experts, we often, if we see a meaning we don't understand, we automatically think it's a metaphor. That's not generally the right way to go about it. It might be a metaphor. It might not, right? So the ulama generally look for evidence of that. Is there a rational reason to? Is there a textual reason to? That's generally how they deal with that, and that's kind of an axiomatic thing. So anyway, to re-summarize kind of the hadith one more time, inshallah, and then wrap up there, the hadith is communicating to us that Ramadan is a great season, right? It's a great season, and you can hear behind me the drummers in Istanbul that are waking people up for suhoor. So forgive me for that, and Allah reward them. The hadith is communicated as a great season. It's a season to do good, where good is made easy, evil is made more hard, right? And it's a time to kind of, if we can put it this way, roll up our sleeves and try to benefit from it, and try to kind of cut off any attachment to that which leads to hell, and strengthen our connection to that which leads to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to heaven. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we benefit from that. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He forgives us of our sins, large and small. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.